Hey all you Microsoft Teams yaks out there in Omaha365 land, welcome to Omaha365 and rolling out Microsoft Teams for the enterprise. I'm Russ, Basiura, and today we're going to talk about everything from planning Microsoft Teams rollout through to driving user adoption. Before we get started, I want to thank David and his team for everything they did to make this community event possible. It's an amazing learning opportunity for all of us, so thank you so much, David, and everyone involved. I also want to thank the sponsors for everything that they do in order to help these events be successful and make them possible. Please take time to talk with each of the sponsors, reach out to each of the sponsors, and get to know what they do, understand how their product helps and what value add they're bringing. Help build that connection and engage with those sponsors. So let's get started. Rolling out Microsoft Teams in the enterprise. So as I mentioned, my name is Russ Basiura. I am the founder and CEO of XL365. We are a Microsoft partner located just outside of the Philadelphia area. I've been doing consulting and in the Microsoft space for 20 plus years at this point. I got started as part of the development team for SharePoint in Redmond in 1999. And most of the work I was doing at that point was really testing. But I've been involved with SharePoint since before it was SharePoint. I spent 10 years growing a Microsoft Gold certified partner. And as I mentioned, I ran that in the Philadelphia area for about 10 years and ran the Philadelphia area SharePoint user group for about 8 of those 10 years. And I've done other type of events, SharePoint conference, several SharePoint Saturdays, written some books on SharePoint security, .NET. So about 2.5 years ago, I got involved with Microsoft Teams and started helping companies roll out Teams. So I want to give you and share. So I want to share with you the benefit of those 2.5 years experience and what I found works, what's successful with Teams, and what are the key things that you need to be doing to make sure your organization is successful. So our agenda for today is I'm going to cover a couple things pretty quickly to start with. The architecture and the current environment and what you need to know about that. How to go about doing your network planning. Then we'll talk about Microsoft Teams clients and the various clients that are available. And then we're going to touch on licensing. And then after that, we're going to get into the rest of our presentation and we'll talk about organizing and managing teams, the security around them, change management and adoption. And then we will actually do a demo of the Teams Advisor that's inside of the Teams Central Admin Console. Typical Teams implementation really has 5 key areas. One of the things you want to start with is gathering your team and, so all of your stakeholders, your champions, and whoever you think are going to be early adopters. Get that group together and then work on prioritizing business scenarios for how Teams fits into your business processes. And this is one of the areas that I really find a lot of companies have a challenge with Teams because they very much want to go into it with the thinking of, I have to have a sales team, I have to have a marketing team, I have to have an engineering team. More typical departmental structures around companies. And you need to kind of take a step back from that and think about your business processes. Think about the members of your company that are involved in those business processes and structure your teams primarily around those processes. So things like customer acquisition, lead generation, product engineering, employee onboarding, customer onboarding are all examples of business processes, and to use those to align your teams around those. One of the reasons for that is because you're going to have members from across the company that are going to take part in that team in making sure that business process is successful. So once that's done, once you have that prioritization completed, then you'll go into doing your technical planning. And we'll talk about the network planning today. We'll talk about the different areas that are required for deployment. Once you have those pieces together, you're really at this point ready to start some pilots internally. And at that point, you should be ready to start. Once you've gathered all of your stakeholders and you've prioritized your business scenarios and you've done your basic technical planning, then you're ready to jump in and start a pilot at that point. When you begin your pilot, choose a pilot that's not going to be overly complex and aim for low-hanging fruit to get started so that you can demonstrate the value of teams. You have an opportunity for everyone, that is all of your stakeholders, to learn teams and understand how it might fit into the business processes. So start with something simple and then move from there. And then lastly, the last phase is, to basically how to measure teams, manage it, and drive adoption of teams. So we're going to talk through this overall process as we go through the discussion today. So in this slide, I'm going to try and cover 4 areas with one slide. Essentially, we're going to touch on your architecture and your current environment. We're going to talk briefly about network planning and what's in Teams that help you with your network planning process. We'll touch on the licensing at this stage, and then we'll talk about the Microsoft Teams clients. Teams is integrated with existing Office 365 workloads, enhancing end users' collaborative capabilities while leveraging existing services they are already likely to be using. So Teams is built on the Microsoft 365 platform. So things that you want to start thinking about is, has your organization already deployed other Microsoft 365 workloads? If so, there's probably lessons learned there that you can incorporate into your deployment of Teams. Have you set up the tenant in that case? Is it tied to Active Directory? Are you syncing using Azure Active Directory Connect? Or how are you managing the on-prem versus off-prem Azure AD in the cloud? How are you, have you deployed Exchange? Is it hybrid mode? Is it online? Same with SharePoint. Do you have SharePoint on-prem? Is it running in hybrid mode, or is all of your SharePoint content in the cloud today? Also, in terms of Skype, if you're using Skype today, how are your users using that? What Microsoft 365 licenses you may have in place versus what you may need for Teams. Teams in itself is not going to really require more licensing because it's part of most of the SKUs that are available. So some things to just keep in mind. I mentioned about Azure AD Connect. You really do want to be syncing your IDs from your on-prem Active Directory into Azure AD. The tool to do that with is Azure AD Connect, and essentially that does the synchronization, and there's a lot of capabilities in there to manage what IDs are synchronized, so you don't actually have to sync your entire internal directory. You can filter out accounts by department. You have a lot of capabilities to basically manage that. So That's a great place to start with it. And it also gives you the capability to synchronize your passwords so that instead of your users having to log in with 2 different IDs, manage 2 different identities essentially between your on-prem and your cloud, you can have a seamless experience moving from internal to external and having just a single user ID and password that your users need to remember. So Teams, it also requires SharePoint Online. You have to have SharePoint Online for that because it uses it to store both some of the chat data and typically files, and then your content on your files area gets stored inside of a site collection inside of SharePoint Online. So also when you're creating a new Microsoft team on the back end, you're actually creating an Office 365 group. If the person creating the team is an owner of your Microsoft, if the person creating the team is an owner of an existing Microsoft 365 public or private group, they can add Teams functionality to that group. So they don't have to create something completely new. They can leverage the existing group. So network planning. Teams really combines 3 forms of traffic: data from your Microsoft 365 online environment and external data sources with the Teams client. It uses peer-to-peer real-time communication traffic and conferencing and real-time communications traffic. Inside of the Teams Admin Center, there is a tool for network planning that will help you through the process of understanding the amount of usage, the amount of bandwidth that will be utilized by Teams on your network. So you can basically set it up so that it give it the information for what you have on your network now, the amount of bandwidth that's available, and the number of users that you have that are going to be using Teams and where they're locating it. And you can basically build out the complete structure. So if you have multiple locations and all, you can specify that. You can specify, what each address range is that they're using. You can specify the number of users on that, and you can map out essentially your whole network and then run a calculation, and Teams the Teams advisor will calculate the amount of bandwidth that is expected to be utilized based on the information that you fed into it. So it'll give you an idea of whether you need to increase bandwidth or just what the impact is going to be to your network. So highly recommend you taking a look at that tool inside the Teams Admin Center. So licensing. So as I mentioned, most of the SKUs all have some version of Teams included as part of them. That at least they contain that core functionality for chat, your meetings, your audio, your video, and your basic content. All of the subscriptions you can use any of the clients with. So whether you want to use a desktop client, you want to use the web client, you want to use the mobile clients, they're all have access to them through as part of those subscriptions. And we're actually going to touch on licensing. I think I have one more slide for it as we get a little deeper, and I'll show some of the different SKUs and what each has with it. And so we'll revisit that area once again. So I mentioned the Teams clients. There's really 3 different types of clients. There's the web client, there's the desktop client, and then there's the different mobile apps, and depending on what platform you're on. So you have an iOS app, you have an Android app that are available for it. So with a desktop, there's both a 32-bit and a 64-bit version. I don't think I've ever seen anybody running the 32-bit version, but there is a 64-bit version for it there, and but you have your options based on the architecture, your internal architecture, and what you guys are running on the desktop. And it's actually the Teams client's agnostic of the Office version that you're running. So if you're running, Office 2010, you could still use the current Teams client with that. Admin rights are not required on Windows, but they are required on Mac. So you want to keep that in mind if you have a large population or anybody that's using Mac. You're going to need to give them admin rights. The desktop clients can be downloaded and installed directly by your end users because they don't need admin rights to do that. But admins can also download the installer and basically distribute that out to the clients and push that out. So I mentioned the mobile apps. The mobile apps are all distributed and updated through the different platforms, app stores. So they just go into the Apple Store and basically download it from there. So I think that's it for that. So let's jump in and talk about organizing teams. So before going down the path of the technical implementation details, let's first understand how Teams is organized. So Teams is really made up of two different areas: your team itself and channels. And essentially a team is designed to bring together a group of people that work closely to get things done. Teams basically Teams can be designed around a project area, for example. So if you have an IT project, Microsoft Teams deployment, you can define it around that. As I mentioned earlier, you can also define them around your business processes as well. So a team is designed to bring together a group of people that work closely together to get things done. Teams can be dynamic for project-based work. Example, it could be launching a product, creating a new war room, as well as ongoing to reflect the internal structure of your organization. Each team enables you to include your conversations, files, notes across the channels that are only visible to members of that team. The channel helps organize the team's conversations, content, and tools around a specific topic. So channels can be organized by topic, discipline, project, or just fun stuff. Team owners can create channels and enable team members to create channels as needed. Tabs along the top of the channel enable teams to keep files, notes, and customized content, such as Power BI metrics, business goals on a Word document and word chart, PowerPoint slide, whatever type of content that they're working for and needs to be easily accessible by everyone in the team. There's also connectors from third-party applications for things, just as an example, Salesforce, that you can then plug in access to Salesforce content. You've got things like CATS for candidate application tracking system, be able to plug that in, as well as a variety of other ones like Trello and GitHub, and there's a lot of different connectors out there at this point. So creating teams. What I really recommend is that each company starts with 4 teams. And as you go through using these 4 teams, they basically give you the opportunity to learn and start. They give you the opportunity to learn how to use Microsoft Teams and the functionality and all that's there. It gives you an opportunity to build that base set of skills. Gives you the opportunity to build that base set of skills across your project team, and all of your stakeholders. So whether they are the sponsors or whether they are your champions within the business areas, by using this starter set, it gives everybody the capability to start building that basic skill set. And you can move then into using or defining what other areas and teams that you need for your business processes. So the very first one I recommend is a deployment team. And this is something that Teams actually provisions for you. There's a capability inside of the Teams Admin Center called Teams Advisor. And we're going to take a look at this, but what it will actually do is it will create a team, I think it's called deployment, inside of Microsoft Teams, and then will provision a series of channels based on each workload that you are going to be doing for the deployment. So if you're basically deploying just the chat and the content capabilities, collaboration capabilities, it'll create one channel for that, and it gives you all of your tasks that you need to be thinking about in order to be successful in deploying that workload. If you're going to be deploying meetings and that meeting capability, that's another workload. So therefore, another channel would be created inside of the team. And then lastly, I think the last one is actually for if you're upgrading from Skype. That's another workload, and that can also create a channel and all the tasks that you need to be thinking about in order to be successful doing that, deploying that workload within the enterprise. So the others that I typically recommend are, and we're going to kind of take a look at each of these in a little more detail, but you want one to, and I call it get to know Microsoft Teams. And this is basically just a place for you to have a knowledge base, to start building content for your users that's company specific help information, so that they can start things like, as you have as an example, if you take a business process and you start using that Teams within that business process, you can document that success story inside of this area so that your users have real world examples of how the company is being successful using Teams. It really kind of helps them understand what's in it for them when they're using Teams. And then the third team is one for your champions. And this is different than your deployment team, because your deployment team is really, for the most part, it's IT folks that are doing the deployment there because of the workloads and all that are involved. The Teamwork Champions team is one that's more, how are we going to be successful with Teams from a business perspective? How can we learn from each other in terms of being successful? The third team is your Teamwork Champions team. And this team is there to support all of the champions across your business with whatever they need, to make sure that they have the information to be successful in supporting their end users and helping them to explain all of the different ways that Teams can be utilized within the business. It's a great place to keep success stories as you start building that base. And, I said start small, pick on things that are low-hanging fruit, but document each of those and keep those in this area. Any other information that is specific to the champions group, this is a great place to keep it. I'll mention that one of the things I like to do is have at least once a month, have like a user group meeting for anybody that wants to join across the company, a volunteer group. You can actually you can store those recordings of those meetings here, so that your champions have access to that. And then lastly is an all company team. And this is basically a single team that everyone within the company has access to, so that when you need to communicate anything out to the business, this is where it would go. So let's take a look at each of those individually. So this is an example structure. Now, you can see the one that's highlighted within the deployment team here, chat, teams, channels, and apps. That's the channel to support the workflow, That's the channel to support the collaboration workload that is generated by Teams Admin Center also. But you'll notice that I created several other channels here. So the general channel is created by default, but you want to have a channel to support any information around awareness and adoption. There's things that you can do, just examples of, like posters that you can use to help drive adoption within your company, emails, examples, all of that type of stuff can be stored within the awareness and adoption channel. You can have a business engagement, early adopters, to support any type of pilots that you're going on. And these are just an example of some of the channels that we've created to support each area of our deployment projects with clients. Everything through, from strategy and planning all the way down to training. So get to know Microsoft Teams. This is again, it's a team that it initially will be available for basically your project team and your key stakeholders. But as you build up the content within this team, it's something that you're going to want to give everybody across your company access to. And it just gives them a place to submit ideas for future teams, or ideas for functionality, or even submit, things that aren't working for them properly, and to be able to get more information around it. So you have a support channel there, and then you have your success stories. So your teamwork champions, these are your champions across the company. So you want to have a place for them to store best practices, trainings, and any type of how-to information. They're going to need, as the champion within each business area, they're going to need more of this information and support from your deployment team, so that they can work with their local users. So, this is a great place to keep information like governance, information on provisioning of new teams, information on how to handle security, adding new members to each team. That's something that you can handle there. The Champions Corner is just it can be that place for communication just between the champions, so that they can learn from each other, but it gives them an area to basically support that function. And then last, you can have one for like feedback and support from the champions. So this is all an area that's restricted to your champions. So, and then the company all one. And the idea here is just to have a single team that encompasses everybody within the company. So, the typical things that you can do within here is you can have an announcement. So any type of company-wide announcements, instead of sending them out through email or, distributing them that way, you can basically put them into this team, and everybody will get a Teams notification that is there. You can also do things like have this as a single place that they can go and get their email inside of Teams. So they don't have to leave Teams and go to Outlook to get their email. They could actually have it right within this company team, and it's a single location within Teams that they can access their email. And then lastly, with this, you want to basically build showcases. So we talked a little bit about the proof of concepts and running pilots with your champions, focusing on those low-hanging fruit. When you go through that early stage in your implementation process and you prioritize the business goals and initiatives and all around it, that's a stage where you want to identify things that are like low cost, easy to do, with value returned back to the business. It doesn't have to be enough value to justify doing the entire project, just something that the business is getting value out of and everybody can see the benefit of. So it gives your stakeholders a way, again, to start utilizing teams on a daily basis and start incorporating it into their business processes. And then from there, you can start going to more complex projects that are going to have a greater return on investment for the company. So with those low-hanging fruit, focus on solving small business problems with it, and don't tackle the big initiatives first. So to sum up what we just kind of went through, you want to essentially build showcase teams. Examples of how teams can help your business. Start with a set of pilots that is prioritized by your champions and your stakeholders and sponsors. Focus on things that are low-hanging fruit, that are easy achievements, that return value to the business. And as you become more and more familiar with teams and start integrating it into more processes, you'll get the opportunity to go to, bigger, more complex projects. But, start by solving small business problems and don't tackle the big initiatives until you've got a track record of being successful with teams. Decisions that you need to make within this section. You want to define what the initial teams are that you're going to start with to support those initiatives and what channels that need to be there for the pilot. And you want to define what the key team members are for each team and channel, as well as the privacy setting for it. So this table here just gives you a easy way to sum that up before you go out and start creating teams. Our next area is Teams policies. I've included this because Teams has a lot of functionality that is policy driven, and there's multiple different types of policies inside of the administration center that you want to be aware of and configure at the start of your deployment, because it drives what functionality is available inside of Teams for your users. So some of the different types of policies include setup policies for applications, actual Teams policies, messaging policies, meeting policies, live events policies, and then a lot of different types of calling policies, as well as permission policies. So you want to take the time to basically go through each of these and configure the settings uniquely for your organization. As a general rule, I recommend keeping as much of the functionality enabled as possible. But if you have regulation requirements or compliance requirements that require certain things to be shut down, this is where you want to go to make those configurations on a policy basis. Also, Microsoft has included different types of policy packages based on the type of organization. So these are the ones that are available at this point. You can see there's several education and healthcare policies that are available there, as well as a few others for small and medium businesses or government facilities. So these basically, if you're an education institution, you can set this to start the overall configuration of teams based on what a typical education institution would require. External access. So external access lets your teams and Skype for business users communicate with other users that are outside of your organization. By default, your organization can communicate with all external domains. So what that means is if you want to basically be able to message somebody else that is either running Skype or Teams, you can do that out of the box. It is enabled. I usually recommend to leave that enabled. I think that's one of the greatest functionalities of Teams. If the other company is either a Skype user or on the Microsoft 365 platform and has Teams, you can communicate with them in real time right away with Teams. So that's functionality that I still see a lot of organizations don't even understand that they have, and they'll revert to using emails to send communications back and forth for things as simple as, what time are we meeting for lunch? When they could be using the chat capabilities. Just because they're an external organization doesn't mean that you can't communicate with them. So you want to take a look at external access. If your organization's okay with having that configured by default to be enabled, which again is the setting that I would recommend for most organizations, then you're good to go with that. But if you have regulatory requirements or anything that basically existing policies in place that prevent that, this is where you would go to disable that capability. Guest access, to be defined as being different than external access. Yes, they are both involving third parties. The difference here is that guest access is specifically to let people from outside of your organization access your teams and channels, as opposed to external access, which is access to messaging. So, this is a tenant level setting. Again, it can be turned on or off, and is turned off by default. But once enabled, a Teams owner in Teams can add and manage guests from third-party organizations to share information. There is a capability for this to be enabled only for specific domains. If you want to be able to give guest access to those third-party companies, you can do it just based on the domain. In order for a company to be able to use guest access, they do have to be on, it either needs to be an Azure Active Directory or a Microsoft 365 work or school account. Managing teams. So service administration. Administrations of teams is designed to be decentralized and put that power into your champions' hands so that they can manage the teams within their business areas. It basically removes the burden of doing any type of user administration all from your IT team and puts that in the power of the end users who know the data and the needs best. And this is where you really need to trust them to be able to manage that from an IT perspective. So you want to make sure that each user is assigned a license. But from that perspective, the team should be allowed to grow organically. And, that's just how you empower your end users and enhance their ability to collaborate and get things done. It is a business tool. Teams is designed to be a business tool. That's why I keep going back and harping on, when you're designing your teams, look at your business processes. Design your teams around your business processes, not your hierarchical structure in your business. Managing teams should be handled through the Teams desktop client. Any teams enabled with user permissions to create a Microsoft 365 group can create a new team and will become an owner of that team. And by default, all users with a mailbox in Exchange Online have the ability to create Microsoft 365 groups. So in terms of managing teams, there's a couple questions you want to ask yourself as you're making decisions, and what's the process for onboarding teams across your organization? Which team settings will your organization turn on or off, and will all teams be able to create teams? And will all teams users be able to create teams? So Team Services Advisor, I mentioned this earlier. This is just a quick look at how Microsoft helps you through the process of implementing teams. There's a planner plan that is automatically provisioned as part of a deployment team that steps you through all of the tasks required for each workload. So let's jump in and take a look at that now. All right, so here we are inside of Teams Advisor in the Admin Center. So we're in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, and scroll down the left-hand navigation rail, and you'll see under Planning, you get a Teams Advisor option. Also under here is the Network Planner that I mentioned earlier that'll help you calculate the required bandwidth for your network that will be utilized by Teams also. So these are two great tools that you need to know are there for when you're planning your Teams deployment. So let's take a look at the Teams Advisor. And when you create this, you will have an option. This will start by asking you to create a team if there's no team found. And when you basically say to create team, it'll go out and it'll provision a deployment team based on the name and all that you've given it. So I've created that team already, and jump over here, and you can see we have a deployment team that's been created, and it has the general channel, and then it also has a workload for the chat, Teams, and Channels apps. So if we go back to our Admin Center here in Teams Advisor, you can see at the bottom here that I've already deployed this workflow, and when you basically do that, it goes out and it creates a new channel for that. Now, if you have other workloads that you're working on, I mentioned that you have ones for meeting and conferencing, and you can have one for a Skype business upgrade. So let's take the meeting and conferencing, and let's say create that. And it's going to go out and it's going to create a channel with a planner plan specific for that workload. So this will take just a minute. There you go. It's created. So now if we go back out here and we refresh our web client, we'll see that we now have the meeting and conferencing channel also within our deployment team. So taking a look here, this is to chat and Teams. Across the top here, we have our typical, posts for our chat conversations around the project, our files area for any files that need to be stored. We get our typical wiki. And what I want to really show you here is the forms and the planner tabs. And under forms by default, you get a user satisfaction form that you can ask your users to fill out. So, what's their overall experience been with Teams, what features are helpful, And it gives you a place to start in terms of just some of the basic questions to ask your users. But then you can take this and you can add any custom questions that you want to add to make this form specific to your company. So take advantage of that, and then as each one response comes in, it'll be listed out here on the responses tab, and as you have those, then you can export them to Excel also, so it's an easy way to share that information. So that's the user satisfaction form. And then in terms of our planner plan, you can see here it's a typical plan, but you have a bucket that's created for your project kickoff, and it has the dates and the priority, and you can specify the start and end dates or due dates for it. You can specify whether it shows this as a card or whether it shows it as tasks with that. So here it'll show a subset of the description on the card. Now there's a lot of information there, so that's why they give you the capability to turn that on or off. As you go down here, though, you also have a checklist of items. So these are kind of the subtasks that are required to complete the main task. So they're each defined here, and you have the capability to say whether they're complete or not. And you can also say whether they show up on the card. So you can see here that you've got, do you want your notes to show on the card, or do you want your required checklist to be shown on the card? I like the checklist personally. But then you can add attachments to this, any type of comments, and then it also tracks a history of changes to the status of this task. So typical planner functionality, but you can see you have one for each phase here. You have your different buckets defined, and then the tasks that are required within each of those. And it seems like the descriptions are showing on most of those. But you also have capability to categorize them. So just different ways of viewing information and being able to track a detailed list of the tasks and all that are required in order to successfully complete the implementation teams at your company. So just more adoption. So make sure this is here and that your deployment team is using it. You also have the meetings and conferencing here, which is just the other workload. You get that form again for this, as well as you get a plan, and the planner here is specific to this meetings and conferencing workload and all the tasks that are defined in here. So you can see you've got buckets for configure meetings, configure audio conferencing, configure your live events, and as well as, if you could see in the beginning here, we had the standards for set up this project, but then from that bucket forward, they're all unique to the actual workload that is being deployed. So just a great way to keep your project on task and all. And you can see it's even got some attachments that are included as part of it to help make sure your team has the information needed to complete that specific task. So that's the Team Services Advisor. And as I showed you before, that you also had the other workload that could be added in there for Skype for Business and completing that upgrade if that's relevant for your organization. So make sure you're using Team Services Advisor. All right, so on to our next area. Let's take a look at the network planner that is available for you to basically help you determine the network requirements for connecting people that use Teams across your organization. So Microsoft's provided this tool to help you calculate the bandwidth requirements for Teams based on the number of users that you have. So within the tool, you can have the capability to add a new network plan and as well as locations. So in this case, I've said that we have our Philadelphia location and we have 1,000 users there, and we can add a second location and say, let's call it Redmond, and we can give it a friendly name. We can create an address for it. And specify the region. So let's say United States, not jumping down. Select United States. We can put in our street address and all with it. So I already did this, but if I want Microsoft Way, Redmond, select our state, and I don't know what the zip code is there, so we'll just add that in and we'll save that location. So that now gives us a second location that we've added. So now you can specify how many network users do you have at that location. Let's say 5,000 for this one. And what your network settings are. So, you know, what network are you on there? Enter your network range. If you have other subnets that you're using, you can add multiple subnets in. Specify other information here about your actual network, and you know whether you're using PSTN or not, and basically set that network at that point. So now you can see we have the 2 locations that are actually completed with the information that's needed. So now if we want to take a look at a report, we can say add a report and include both that Philadelphia and the Redmond location, and come down and just say generate the report. Say all locations, so that we give the report a name. You know, what's the allowed bandwidth that's available even for Teams. And so I'm just going to leave that at default by 30%. Why can't we run the report here? So you can see here you're setting up your calculation for each location. What percentage of users are office workers, which percentage of users are remote workers. You can define those actual numbers, not percentages, the actual numbers of users is split. And then the report needs a name. say all locations, come down, hit generate report. Okay, now it goes out and generates the report. And you can see here we've got our 2 locations specified and the amount of traffic that you need for each of these. All right, so let's take a quick look at security. So Microsoft Teams leverages your common Microsoft 365 authentication schemes. The cloud identity, which is purely maintaining all of your identities in the cloud in Azure AD. Synchronized identity, which is essentially a hybrid between having an on-premise Active Directory store that is synchronized using Azure Active Directory Connect, otherwise known as AD Connect, to synchronize filtered IDs to Azure. I mentioned earlier that you can use that to really filter down subsets of IDs to be moved over to the cloud, so you don't actually have to move all your identities over. And then there's federated ID, which is having an ADFS, Active Directory Federated Services deployment, where access to Microsoft 365 services will redirect to the ADFS deployment for on-premises authentication and authorization. Additionally, there's multi-factor authentication, so things like smart cards and certificates that can be used for authentication. So a couple questions you just kind of want to make sure you answer. What security features do you actually need? Do you need to be able to synchronize IDs from an existing store to the cloud? What other types of security do you need for your end users? What types of compliance features do you need to be able to, prevent data loss? Do you need to be able to apply compliance policies? Those type of things, from a business requirements perspective. So, change management and adoption. So, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but go into a little more depth. Your executive sponsors, these are the key leaders within the business organization, and their participation is essential in terms of driving employee adoption. If the leadership team does not demonstrate that they are using Teams and demonstrate their support for the value and benefits, and if that's not communicated to the organization, then you're going to be at a big disadvantage in terms of driving adoption. So that's like the first thing that has to happen. You have to get that executive sponsor on board, and hopefully it's multiple executive sponsors at the C level, so the entire organization's adopting Teams. Service owners and IT professionals are responsible for ensuring people use the service and get value from it. The champions group, which can help alleviate the challenge and play an important role in the adoption of Microsoft 365. This group is knowledgeable and committed to furthering their expertise with the Microsoft 365 platform, but these are the guys that are also experts within business processes for your different areas of the business. And that's what makes them so critical in terms of the success of Teams. I've mentioned multiple times about tying your teams to business processes versus departmental level teams. You may need a combination of both, but the teams that drive widespread adoption across your organization are going to be the teams that are defined around your business processes like customer acquisition. So defining a champion for that business process and having them have the knowledge necessary to support the users about both Teams and the business process is critical for success. and then defining a pilot group of users. And in this case, it's just the first set of users. So when you sit down in that initial meeting and you define your business prioritizations and set the priority across the different potential projects for teams that are used, and I said about aiming for low-hanging fruit, you want to define that group here. They're your pilot users. So just going back again, kind of summarizing our discussion, you want to identify your key stakeholders and user audiences. You want to define and prioritize your business outcomes. You want to design and launch your adoption campaign. You want to build a champions program and make sure the champions are getting the support that they need to be successful in their roles. It's a ongoing training that they really need to be involved with. Provide a standard feedback mechanism. I showed you the user satisfaction forms for each of the workloads within the Teams Advisor. Take that, extend it, do what you need with it, but utilize it to collect feedback from your end users on a regular basis and make sure they're not getting frustrated with something that can be easily resolved. Measure and share the success. So, document what your success stories are. Make sure you're able to measure the outcomes for that and the return on investment for the business. And then adjust your messaging and methods based on the feedback and, repeat. So each time you have a new business process that's coming online, follow the same steps for being successful and collect your feedback, and then move on to your next project. So there is a customer success kit, and I have a URL for you, which I believe is aka.ms// that is success with Teams, and I have that on a resource slide at the end. But there is a great success kit that Microsoft has put together that includes everything from like email templates to announcements to flyers to posters, just all types of tips and tricks to help you be successful in driving adoption within your company. So some questions that you just want to make sure that you're able to answer. Make sure you do have a change management strategy in place. Have that defined. How is your organization going to handle changes? How have they done this in the past with other similar technology rollouts? Who are your executive sponsors, champions, service owners, that will influence the success of teams? And then who's going to be your pilot group? I also wanted to make mention of usage reports. I had mentioned earlier about being able to measure and track success. So put together a baseline from where you're starting with Teams and be able to document the increase in usage and where Teams is being utilized the heaviest, so that you can basically use that in helping to drive user adoption. One of the stories that I always tell, and I try and look for this within every technology solution. There's kind of two sides to it, but in terms of calculating return on investment, one of the things is, how are you making your users more efficient? So if you can save every user 5 minutes a day that's part of a business process, and your average salary for your employees is $75,000, take those numbers across the number of employees that you have within your organization and do a calculation for the return on investment that you're getting from teams from that perspective. If you're using teams externally with your business partners, and this is actually can be more difficult to calculate, but if you are more efficient and can respond to customer and partner needs quicker, your customers and partners are going to view your company more favorably. And most times that's going to have a positive impact on stock prices. So, tying different types of rollouts to stock prices can be another way of measuring it, because, when you have, millions and millions of shares of stock, it only takes a couple pennies difference to have a big impact on the valuation of the business itself. So if you are using teams to collaborate better with your business partners and customers, see if there's a way to tie it back to a change in the valuation of the company. So thank you very much for joining. I hope you got some value out of this session. I can be reached on LinkedIn. That's the best way to reach me. And also my YouTube channel. Please visit out there. I've got a lot of different videos on teams and how to be more successful with teams. So, if you like what you see, please subscribe. And thank you so much for being part of Omaha 365. Take care.